Yeah, I think I'll just kind of jump into it. On the 16th of November 2023, Jürgen Habermas, Rainer Forst, and Nicole Dittelhoff and Klaus Gunther signed Principles of Solidarity, a statement in which they insisted that the role of critical theory today was to be clear about not attributing genocidal intentions to Israel's actions against the Palestinian people, who are referred to in their statement as, and to quote them, the Palestinian population. According to the statement, the primary concern of the representatives of the Frankfurt School today is to refine what they call, between quotes, the standards of judgment, and defend the ethos, as I will show at the end, of the Federal Republic of Germany, that is based on the obligation to respect human dignity and protect primarily Jewish life and Israel's unquestionable right to exist as a Jewish state. There's no other mention of the Palestinian people in the statement. The sole and primary task of critical theory today, according to its signatories, is to fend off the return of anti-Semitism. They single out October 7 as an event that has no historical narrative of its own beyond that of German politics, of memorialization and reconciliation, as though the 7th of October was an attack against Germany and Europe and not against an ongoing colonial occupation. They also effectively equate in this statement anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. This issue is not the focus of my discussion here. Rather, I can point to numerous recent critical engagements in, for instance, the latest historical materialism special issue on the topic of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Rather, what I'm concerned with is the claim that the task of critical theory today is to point out the standards of judgment. This could not be farther from Marx's critical contribution to the analysis of modern society and its contradictions. Critical theory must not be allowed to descend into this task of safeguarding the normative liberal order and the defense of a fictive public sphere that is bereft of ideologies. For this definition of the task of critical theory is nothing but one step away from what we could call bourgeois moral philosophy. Amy Allen has developed a critique of the normative turn in critical theory. However, this critique, I will suggest, is inadequate. It asks the right questions, but offers the wrong answers. In her attempt at decolonizing critical theory, Allen proposes bringing together Foucault and Habermas to attune critical theory to the mechanisms of power implicit in the propagation of a teleological belief in progress. The normative turn, according to Allen, can benefit from Foucault's historicism or his historical a priori. In the end, decolonizing critical theory implies opening it up to post-colonial theory. And this is, in fact, a direction that is being actively pursued today by the Frankfurt School through what I would imagine are kind of a reusing or repurposing of old and tried sociologies of knowledge as an entryway. I suppose nobody reads any longer Adorno's decimating critique of Mannheim. But I want to turn attention here to one specific signatory of the letter and the letter of solidarity. And I can just kind of give a background here. I was precisely a speaker at this kind of Frankfurt School post-colonial studies kind of conference, and in fact had a chance to have a debate with Forst online, and we can talk about his responses to what I will proceed to present later on. It was by kind of the moment of invitation and the ongoing kind of, by then the genocide on the Palestinian people had already kind of been 3-4 months underway, and hence my engagement with his work was precisely driven by the attempt to really understand how is it that this, what are the theoretical grounds, or what is it in his work that allows for the blind spot or the position that he takes on Palestine, along with Habermas and the other signatories of letter. So I will focus really specifically on Forst in this discussion. Rainer Forst, whose work on theories of justification, we'll see, in his work on theories of justification, what I would call an unstated union between Habermas and Foucault. And I'll proceed to kind of show how that is kind of implicit, this union or alliance between Habermas and Foucault in his work. And the motivation for me is to understand the theoretical and ideological grounds for the apologetic stance of critical theorists exists today, and to argue that perhaps a real proper decolonizing of theory would have to overcome its kind of cynical instrumentalization of normativity. Because in the end, the question has to be, how is it justifiable to claim that one's people's suffering outweighs the suffering of others? Okay, and I will kind of this is what I was going to kind of proceed to develop in my talk. Both Habermas and Foucault develop an account of politics that is both consensual and grounded in the normative as a field of justifications. Politics in the wake of Habermas and Foucault can only be thought as a reconciliation of morality and ethics. Procedural claims for Habermas on the one side and valuable ways of life for Foucault are differences in kind within the general normative project of modernity. Despite the appearance of antagonism, for instance, Habermasians and Foucauldians today share a fundamental commitment. Since there's no longer any kind of horizon of social revolution or social transformation, all resistance is already co-opted and merely a Janus face of what it opposes, then the institutions of capitalist liberal democracy provide for both Habermasian and Foucauldians the unsurpassable horizon for political contestation. What I'm calling the Foucault-Habermas alliance in critical theory today has three features. One, it lacks a theory of mediation, and it cannot account for how social forms of capitalism mediate different kinds of domination in relationship to structures of exploitation. And I will make an argument that Forst collapses domination with exploitation in his analysis in a minute. Second, it ontologizes power or violence, either as noumenal power or as a constitutive of the human condition. More crucially, in this account, for both kind of Habermasians and Foucauldians, there are no subjects outside of power relations. It cannot account for subjective violence in relation to systemic and objective forms of violence, and therefore resorts to legalistic and moralistic formulations to fend off the critical task of thinking violence. Critical theory, after Foucault and Habermas, disavows its own complicity in legitimating the liberal democratic state's hold on legitimate violence by projecting a split account of violence onto others. This leads to an acceptable violence, a good violence, one that can be justified ethically and normatively, and a bad violence, one that must be condemned. And fourth point, I think, that brings them together is that both Foucauldians and Habermasians have an inability to think through mass politics beyond reducing them to anachronistic populisms or fetishizations of identity. So what I'm calling this kind of Habermas-Foucault alliance, communicative rationality has come to be supplemented by a Foucauldian account of the pathologies of power. And this theoretical alliance purports that domination is only discursively resolved through the institutions of capitalist liberalism. Violence is at the core of systems of justification and legality. We cannot disavow it, and avowing it entails a commitment to turning critique into the task of distinguishing between violence and non-violence, as I said before, violence that can be justified and a non-violence that is justifiable. Foucault's critique of power re-ontologizes power because it cannot explain the difference between concrete and abstract domination. Power is generative and enabling. If we think here of the distinction he makes between puissance and pouvoir, and the aim of critique lies in releasing puissance or force to resist pouvoir. Although Habermas's account of authority is not metaphysical, it also avows its coercive uses. Reason and coercion come hand in hand, and we see this very clearly in Forst's work. Here, I must recall Mladen Dolar's formulation in his work on authority. I quote, "Violence is always discursively framed, prepared by persuasion, justified by discourse, legitimized by all kinds of arguments. There is no violence without the word that supports it. The long history of wars, ethnic cleansing, pogroms, massacres massively testifies to the fact that all this was thoroughly prepared and constantly underpinned by argument and persuasion." End of quote. So, in a way, I mean, to move now into kind of into Forst, right? first, critical theory. What is critical theory? It's not reductive to say that there is no critical theory without Marx's incorporation of both critique, first signified by Kant's account of the transcendental subject, the Copernican philosophical revolution and whatnot, and dialectical theory, whether born from medieval dialectics and consummated in Hegel. More crucially, however, Marx overcomes both Kant and Hegel by showing that critical consciousness is itself determined by the social forms of modern capitalist society, by the form of value or the form of commodities. Critique is conditioned by social forms, but not entirely reduced to them. A critique that is blind to an account of social forms is blind to the blind spot of its origin. It becomes reduced to reproducing the Kantian transcendental empirical doublet as a defense of bourgeois state institutions. Forst's theory of justification synchronizes what we could call a neo-Kantian, neo-Idealist analysis that has culminated in this kind of HF alliance that I'm calling Habermas Foucault. As we all know, this debate between Habermas and Foucault never really happened, perhaps precisely because they would have had more to agree on than not. In Forst's work, following Habermas and Foucault, rationality and power are indissociable. The skepticism about progress aligns itself with the unstoppable progress of capitalist modernity. Communicative rationality is supplemented by a Foucauldian account of the pathologies of power. And this is kind of the synthesis that purports that domination can only be discursively resolved through the institutions of capitalist liberalism. But it is this precise distinction between authority and power that you would imagine would distinguish Kantianism from Nietzscheanism, which denies it. Internalization of power come authority, in the work of, for instance, Amy Allen, constitutes a self that is capable of rationalizing, of judging, of making distinctions, and of being disciplined. Subjectivity is here molded by a primary scene of repression, although here we must note that Habermas rejects all this kind of Freudian account of repression, through which we become capable to feel obligated by reasons and motivated by them. In Amy Allen's account, the normative becomes a space of reasons organized by authority, which in turn authorizes reason. So kind of Foucault's moral skepticism becomes a welcome partner to Habermas's universal normative commitments. Allen makes a strong point about this kind of cross-contamination between validity and power, a matter she suggests is inescapable, and that Foucault is necessary for understanding, given that we are in a world in which Western moral and political ideals of freedom and democracy continue to be so closely associated with the morally bankrupt projects of colonialism and empire. And in a way, Rainer Forst's theory of justification is closer to Amy Allen's on this than the position on Habermas. Hence, the reason of kind of the questioning around how is it that he could kind of be a signatory of such a statement or be in a position to deny the right of justification to the Palestinian people. And this is what I'll come to. So the statement of solidarity that was kind of published by the Frankfurt School representatives could be seen to be a demonstration of this complicity, the complicity between the ideals of freedom and democracy and colonialism and empire. It's important here to note that historically, Foucauldians did not necessarily have a more salutary position on the anti-colonial struggle in Palestine, although they claimed to be more attuned to the mechanisms of power. We could say, Foucault until the very end was very suspicious of any recent liberation movements. And to quote him, he said that suffer from the fact that they cannot find any principle on which to base the elaboration of a new ethics, end of quote. This is Foucault. So Forst is more generous towards Foucault in his work than Habermas has been. The normative in Forst's theory of justice can only be thought by avowing what he calls the noumenal nature of power. This one here. The normative in Forst's theory of justice can only be thought by avowing what he calls the noumenal nature of power. Power is both thinkable and corruptible. It turns into violence only when it fails to assert its authority, to quote him here. Power should be understood in processual terms as the ability to determine, or if necessary, even to close off or open up the space of reasons for others, whether based on a good argument, an ideological justification, or a threat. Social power does not have its seat in certain means, institutions, or structures, but instead in the noumenal space in which struggles over hegemony take place. Thus, the concept of power is neither positively nor negatively charged, but is instead neutral. Only its modes of exercise, ranging from empowerment to domination and oppression, whether interpersonal or structural must be differentiated and evaluated. And then he continues here, it's a long quote, this will be the longest in the presentation. Power is always discursive in nature, therefore, but it is not always communicative in Habermas's sense or exclusively part of subject constituting disciplining epistemes, as Foucault argues, right? He's gonna bring these two things together. This shows once again the advantages of varying our use of the concept of justification between descriptive and normative understandings. For Forst, the task of critical theory is not to provide a dialectical account of power that grounds it in the social forms of capital, because power is simply not anchored in any such institutions and rather maintains a noumenal or intellectual status. The discursivity of power lies in it not being reducible to neither the rational, pace Habermas, or the disciplinary epistemes, pace Foucault, but to genealogy. Again, this is a quote from Forst. There is no realm of reason beyond power. Therefore, but there are better and worse, reasonable and unreasonable justifications, besides more and less effective ones. So we have to distinguish the normative force of justifications and justification narratives from their quality. We can take this to mean that there's a force in different qualities, persuasive, coercive, or violent. This is a point that Habermas and Foucault would converge on. Although Foucault is interested in the coercive effects of discourse, while Habermas looks more at the material constraints on communication, right, the state and the market, there's really no substantive disagreement on the difference in forces exerted on and by discourse. Again, to continue from Forst. Freedom and power belong together. As long as the latter acts upon cognitively motivated subjects, this is the second quote, power is the art of binding others through reasons. It is at the core of normativity. The spectrum of relations of power, therefore, extends from conditions based on freely shared, reciprocally general reasons at the one end to those situated in the transitional zone where power is replaced by violence at the other. It should be noted in this context that power also exists where cognitive effects are achieved through lies or deception. So cognitively motivated subjects here may imply non-cognitively motivated subjects, perhaps affectively motivated or motivated by pathological interests of reason. Although Habermas is much more interested in taking stock of the pathologies of reason by shifting focus to justification and not communication, Forst deflects the problem while claiming to resolve it. In Forst's rendering, the force of justification is the same. However, it is motivated. Its normative power is the same. And to quote him, again, this is the third quote, justification narratives develop normative power to the extent that they cast the political and social world in a certain light, connect the past, present, and future, reality and ideals, as well as individuals and a collective, and form them into an accepted order of justification, end of quote. So justification itself, in Forst's account, gains a kind of a mediating power. It becomes a form of mediation. This renders all justification as being always already ideological. How justification is a social form in capitalist society remains to be verified, a society which is premised on a foundational injustice that constitutes and permeates all social life. I mean, Marx's fundamental argument against liberals and social democrats of his time was that we cannot posit a moral critique of normative foundations of a social system because morality is largely determined by material conditions. In a sense, capitalism is both a culture and an ecology, so there must be a transformation of society to occur for any alignment of ethics and politics to become possible, right? I mean, this is kind of Marx. So to go back to Forst, so once justification is grounded in, to quote him, a collective perception of its cogency, end of quote, which regardless of its form maintains its force, then it functions as ideology would because it is purely formal regardless of content. However, neither Habermas nor Foucault have a theory of ideology. Indeed, their alliance in Forst's work turns ideology simply into power. Foucault leaves no outside to power. There's no escape from power, right? We practice governmentality and self-care as an inversion of power. There's no outside to power, no way to escape the logic of representation for Foucault. In Forst's account, justification is always already contaminated with power. It cannot escape it. Given that power cannot be undone, the task of critical theory then becomes the development of a theory of justice, whereby justice becomes a new regulative principle that limits power simply kind of from unleashing its noumenal fangs. So for Forst, critical theory must do this because ultimately, in his reading, Marx lacks a political theory. He maintains that Marx's concept of exploitation is a moral concept that lacks a political theory. To quote from him again, exploitation is clearly a moral concept that expresses the violation of personal autonomy and the dignity of counting as an equal. End of quote. Okay, but we should pause here and rethink this assertion. Exploitation for Marx is the extraction of surplus from necessary labor. There is a theft of time in exploitation, right? The essence, which is the essence of human life. From wage labor, from wage labor, which is in turn invisible to bourgeois law. I mean, that's the whole Marx's whole critique is that, the wage labor is invisible to bourgeois law. And in a way, this theft of time is precisely what is meant, or the true meaning of Marx's claim, freedom, equality, property, and Bentham, right? So free wage labor, after all, is not discernible in bourgeois law as illegal force, right? The whole blindness to that is the critique of ideology that Marx begins to develop, right? So the injustice in exploitation is fundamentally the theft of time. It's not what I'm trying to say is not a moral critique. It's a theft of time. It's the time of life, a theft that is not registered as such and is not merely an insult or a dignity, right? An insult to dignity. But for Forst, he argues that Marx's theory of alienation and its overcoming entails a deficit in political concepts because the overcoming of alienation leads to a utopia, in his words, of unmediated, transparent means of organization of collective autonomy. So in a way, he asks, who will then, in so-called post-capitalist society, which is never even kind of brought into discussion, decide on behalf of the collective? And perhaps the question is really posed, who will do that, post-Marx's, what Marx lacks in his theory. So he reads Marx's dialectic of freedom and necessity as entailing an apolitical overcoming of alienation, because it is an overcoming that is neither economic, that is economic and not political. Again, this is Forst. The question of justice as the recovery of a form of political autonomy over economic relations was not part of the Marxian program. Before the Great Turn, this is not possible, after it not necessary. Thus, his notion of overcoming alienation is essentially apolitical, a form of unmediated sociality based on trust in historical necessity and belief in the iron economic laws. Okay, but how can the bourgeois distinction between politics and economics even be squared with a Marxian critical theory? I mean, are these not in themselves forms of reified knowledge? Forst, like other contemporary critics, does not really care for this question, because the normative is prior to the social non-relation imposed by capital. It is prior also in post-capital, right? The reason for this is that Forst collapses domination and exploitation in one move, disregarding the fact that capitalism is a global system of abstract domination, which extracts surplus, socially necessary labor time from necessary labor. No matter how long you work, the value you produce is greater than the value of your labor power. This is not a moral critique. It is a critique of a regime of time. Domination by value requires exploitation, which requires the time of life. Life is in turn subordinated to the production of empty time, surplus value. This is an ontological critique and not simply a moral one. Can we not see clearly this theft of time, of life, the time of life in colonized societies? Colonization is at the heart of capitalist original accumulation. Today, for instance, and as we speak, a colonial state continues its onslaught justified by theorists of justification based on land annexation, transfer, incarceration, armed with genocidal intent. And in the presence of such a declaredly ethno-nationalist state, Palestinians are obstructed, to quote from Forst, despite his blindness to this form of injustice, from, and I quote him, breaking open orders of justification, end of quote, through deliberation and communication. They are excluded from the public sphere, silenced, vilified as human animals, surveilled and policed. So although for Forst, his claim is that, and to quote him again, genuine progress, a concept that critical theory cannot be dispensed with, occurs where there are new levels of justification that are made accessible or are achieved through struggles that make subjects into justificatory authorities in the first place, end of quote. So, however, although he grants all these things, right, he expands clearly a theory of justification, this right to justification is not granted to the Palestinian people, who are tellingly called a population, not a people, in the statement that was signed by the Frankfurt School. So why is this the case? Why does a critical theory of justice exclude a struggle against historical and ongoing injustice? Is it because Palestinians, by choosing a form of armed resistance, forfeit the right to justification that is understood as a communicative strategy? Or is it because the Palestinians succumb to more easily than others to the noumenal fangs of power, which critical theorists like Forst work hard to repress, to keep at bay? Does the explosion of genocidal violence only serve to remind critical theorists of the conceptual point of keeping power at bay? Is it perhaps because Palestinians are not cognitively motivated subjects? So to go back to the earlier point regarding social forms and Marx, the disentanglement of structures of justification from ideas of, this is again a quote from Forst, again why he moves, he's claiming to move beyond kind of the grounds of critical theory in this direction to kind of, because he wants to disentangle theories of justification from, to quote him, ideas of recipients and goods. Right. What this does is it cuts off critique from an account of social forms and capital. More crucially, it blocks critical theory from developing an understanding of the colonial relation as the original capitalist accumulation in the present, and not in terms of concluded struggles from the past to be adjudicated by the resort to human rights discourses. Forst is explicit about this disentanglement, or what we could call a double abstraction of justice. The focus on the concept of justice as, and again to quote from him here, as an autonomous collective process, a structure of justification, end of quote, is to detach justice from this, what he calls ideas of recipients and goods, right? This is again a long quote from him on this. In Forst's democratization of justice, we could call it that, his spreading it out into a collective process of adjudication, Marx, the very thinker of collectivity, now appears to have a reified account of justice. Right, because for Forst, now the reified account of justice is the account that kind of links justice simply to goods and services, right? Because ultimately what he wants to say is people do not care only about goods and services, they care for justifications that they can accept and make acceptable to others. Okay, but here, despite the kind of really kind of simplistic reading of political economy here, we must ask, by what criteria do we then accept and do we then judge reified unpolitical conceptions of justice? What is the regulative principle to which we can resort if justification is always tainted by power, contaminated by the noumena? And if critical theory abandons any account of reification, which is grounded in the real abstractions of social forms, how do we discern unreified concepts from reified ones? In this instance, right, the Palestinian resistance to injustice has been seen to be premised on an a priori assessment of it as a version of kind of, anachronistic Muslim militancy having a deficient concept of justice, clearly. A Foucauldian might not be able to make such a claim, but a Habermasian would. But if we accept Forst's account of power here, then, how is Israeli power really different from Palestinian power in this context? Or is the adjudication simply that Palestinians have no legitimate order of justification or emotive, hence irrational actors? Why does normativity, normative neutrality buckle here in this instance in particular? I think Forst's gesture to this idea of reified concepts of justice is only a window dressing, because his resort to noumenal power renders the discussion of ideology and its relation to domination and exploitation obsolete. Along with the most contemporary critical theorists, Forst has no theory of mediation to account for reification. Rather, the purpose of his engagement is to insist that humans are autonomous agents, able to adjudicate norms, following the Habermasian dictum, Kantian here perhaps. A people cannot be governed except by rules and laws which they accept for themselves and make acceptable to others through deliberation. But this ability to self-legislate or justify norms ought to be exercised against all constraints. And violence emerges only when there is a cut in discourse, to quote him again, and an inappropriate discursive arena in which there is a lack of justification for norms, discursive and institutional. It is only there, Forst argues, that the outbreak of violence causes a weakening of power. Albeit asserting it. Sheer force is a sign of power breaking down because real power is the one that, to quote from him, rests on recognition. with a caveat that recognition is not always reasoned, because you can, for example, recognize the force of a gun, for instance. Again, a quote from Forst: "The exercise and effects of power are based on the recognition of a reason or various reasons, etc." And then if we go to the kind of proceed in the quote, "Power rests on recognized, accepted justifications, some good, some bad, some in between. A threat or a gun can be seen as such a justification, as can a good argument. But power exists only when there is such acceptance," right? So again, in light of Forst's stated solidarity with Israel and not Palestine, with a colonizer and not a colonized subject, how do we make sense of such statements? How is it that this position then legitimates the Israeli resort to violence, but not the Palestinian right to resistance? This realism of power is premised on recognizing the Palestinian as an agent of justification. Palestinian resistance to the sheer force of power cannot be seen as a claim for justification or a demand for recognition even. They are simply sealed off from the space of reasons altogether. They have no right to an equal, and to quote from him, standing as normative authorities with the space of a normative order, end of quote. But this is indeed quite perplexing, because it is Forst himself who opens up this normative, right, the field of the normative, the processes of power, as an attempt of inclusion of all rational agents or cognitively motivated agents. Cognitively motivated is also expanded to include what he calls narratives of justification. So again here, so what is then the reason, right, of this blind spot, or why is this blind spot there? And I mean, I think, ultimately the problem is that he introduces what he calls in his work the force of narrative. Okay. Here, before I move to that kind of, which I think provides the answer for the position he takes and what this Habermas kind of Foucault alliance in his work takes, I want to say another thing to kind of that addresses one of the points around the ontologization of violence, because in Forst's analysis, violence always appears as something that happens in a kind of subjective instance against an objective deadlock, right? Which the objective deadlock is understood as a kind of a lack of justificatory procedures, right? When the other does not understand my justifications, I have a right to enforce them, right? This is where noumenal power becomes, quote from him, sheer physical force. That said, this exhibition of force as brute, repressive, and acting on individuals is already, according to Forst here, a sure breakdown of power, right? Power is unknowable, some people are weak, others are not. Rarely are there, true, to quote from him, leviathans able to wield power. A statement that is really perplexing, that sounds more like a desire for a wish fulfillment than a lament. This position is akin to Foucault's conclusions in his own work. Power cannot be overcome. We can never do away with power. So for Foucault, the answer lies in practices of self-care, governmentality, ethics of the self, refashioning of the self, so on and so forth. Whereas for Forst, the answer lies in what he would call developing a critical theory of relations of justification, which I'm claiming here is really fundamentally uncritical. This theory of justification is primarily tasked with establishing the limits of power, right? Power is so noumenal, we can only hold it back by a theory of justice. And the premise of this theory of justice is to establish this kind of basic structure of justification among free and equal persons as the first demand of justice. This is Forst. Okay, so I want to move to this kind of the force of narrative. Why is it then, right? How is it then according to all this, we can see already some signs of the breakdown, the blind spot, but what is it that really kind of, I think, explains the position that critical theorists like him have taken today? And I think it's really the question of narrative, because he really gives the narrative a fundamental kind of a place in his theory of justification. It centers as it kind of figures as a central mechanism in his account. And what is narrative? Kind of the historical narratives of stories that people use for justification. Narratives are forms of justification, right? Although he keeps maintaining that at the end, the only regulative principle should be about the concept of justice as a right because of the belief in progress and so on. And even though he keeps saying in his work that a nation cannot intervene in a colonial manner into another nation because of the concept of justice, right? And this is the only way to ensure that progress is self-reflexive or self-determining concept. And he insists on this thing, what he calls social self-determination, right? And to the extent that he pushes his theory to claim that the human right to justification has to be included in the rights of man, right? It's a new human right that we have to kind of include, right? So it has to be an inalienable human right. So in light of all this kind of effort at expanding normative frameworks, then, so what is this conceptual deficit, right, that led Forst and Habermas and others like them to exclude the Palestinian people from their right to self-determination against colonization? Why is their thinking halted in this context? Why can they not think the reasons for violence while condemning the violence? How has reason buckled down to the rage of the noumena carried out by a state power? The authority of reason cannot assess the political resort to violence against an occupying power. Why is this so? This is because assessing the legitimacy of the political resort to violence in turn depends on power relations. This is the catch-22 of this theory. Critical theory is stuck in the prison house of the noumena. It posits an ideal that constructs society as a reified object, but it cannot escape its normative framework. The difference between norms and morals, facts and values, cannot be simply adjudicated in forms of consciousness. This works at a level of abstraction that cannot grasp actuality and its misrepresentations on consciousness. Recognizing subjects as actors capable of recognizing injustice does not do away with really existing injustices, right? And this may really help us illuminate this principles of solidarity statement. Perhaps the secret of this unconditional solidarity lies in the force of the narrative of justification that accounts for the Israeli state's, nation state's, ground of justification for its war of unprecedented proportions on Palestinians. The narrative of justification rests entirely on the singularity of the event of the Holocaust for the German national unification project. So in a sense here, this idea of the singularization of the Holocaust, right? The persecution of the Jews is unlike any other persecution. It justifies the aspiration for a religious nation state, unlike any other. Zionism becomes the compensation for German Nazism. We can say here that German critical theory has become German again, right? Universalism buckles under the weight of German national history. Critical theory becomes an apologia for state ideology, right? Israel, in its current ethno-nationalist liberal formation, has a kind of a right that is unquestionable because of narrative histories that originate from within Germany and Europe and against the narratives of justification pertaining to Palestinians. Right. I mean, this thesis on the singularity of the Holocaust fits well into the German account of history. I mean, Sami Khatib argues in a recent piece in Radical Philosophy that anti-Semitism has gained a status of singularity in relation to colonialism, racism, fascism, and it has done so through a specific trajectory that has to do with the internal history of the reunification of Germany. Right, because in a way, Germany is unthinkable as a nation without Holocaust remembrance and memorialization. So singularity here creates the effect, in a way, of a pure present without a past and a future, an end to historical temporality, right? There's a singular crime against humanity unlike any other, right? And this occludes any account of repetition in history, although singularity can repeat with a difference. And the risk of absolutizing it leads us to a blindness about the actuality of conditions of injustice in the contemporary world. This monopoly on legitimate forms of violence, whereby the law cannot mourn, let's put it this way, to borrow from Gillian Rose, its own violence, have become really critical theory's main occupation today. This has also become the very raison d'etre of the nation state as a representative of civil society. Gillian Rose presciently saw this, and she saw a much more sinister shift in the logic of fascism than the endemic fascism analyzed by the Frankfurt School then as the culture industry. She poignantly argued that the new fascism in the postmodern era becomes, to quote from her, the liberal state's monopoly over legitimate violence, end of quote. Rose's stronger claim, of course, in her general work is that postmodernism and poststructuralism, under the influence of Heidegger, reproduce the ideology of the fascism of representation. Ontology and poststructuralism becomes a reading of experience as the identity, posited against Hegel's labor of spirit, which works against identity, seeks freedom through spirit's groundlessness. So this form of theory, right, that Rose kind of points to, which is about the monopolization of legitimate of the state over legitimate violence, corresponds to a postmodern risk society that is only composed of individual taxpayers and consumers and not workers who are patchy marks without substance. So this new ethos of individual civil rights, including Forst's right to justice, does not allow for the structural conditions of inequality to be recognized. Moreover, it is no longer possible in this moment to resort to traditional identities anymore, and this in turn becomes a source for all kinds of libertarian fantasies that mask the existing monopoly of the state over violence, as well as masking what we could call, to quote from Rose, the unleashing of the non-legitimate violence of individualized civil society. This is kind of the really interesting. So on the one hand, you have the state has, the absolute monopoly over legitimate violence. And on the other hand, you have this kind of the non-legitimate violence of individualized civil society, libertarianism with liberalism. And this kind of becomes the really kind of rancid ground for the development of fascism. She calls it also kind of the fascism of representation, the representation of fascism, because it's all premised on this kind of the politics of singularization, of memorialization, on what she calls kind of the resacralization of the Holocaust, right? So yet we are stuck again in this kind of conundrum of law versus ethics, of law versus morality, with no access to a politics that would take a risk for the universal good, to put it in Badiousian terms, or perhaps not so here expandedly, rather than the individual one. Again, this is from Rose. Rose's most radical claim was that fascism becomes the law in post-World War II liberal civil societies, right? I'm really going to read this from her. It's really very incisive. Fascist movements want universal law to apply so that they may have no rivals in their use of non-legitimate violence. They represent the triumph of the civil state, the realm of individual need, the war of particular interests. They exploit the already partisan war of particular interests. They exploit the already partisan mediation of the instrumentalized universal, the epitome of what Hegel called the spiritual animal kingdom. This is how it is possible to anticipate the states that I think we are witnessing the rise of now, which combines social libertarianism with political authoritarianism. Whether they have traditional class parties or not, they become susceptible to these fascist movements. They become fascist themselves. So this alliance between the representation of fascism and the fascism of representation must be countered by a kind of what I would imagine would be a Marxist Hegelianism that refuses the reduction of politics to a moral adjudication based on the power of the will, albeit with all its pathologies, or reason to safeguard private individual interest. Here, the argument essentially is that fascism, like philosophies that abolish representation and replace metaphysics with ontology, what it does, fascism, is it grants power to all agents equally, within it and outside it, but it transforms the dilemma of power to being one concerning the assertion of moral will and the protection of private interest. So as I've shown before, what we could call kind of Forst's immanentism of power and his expansion or extension of Habermas into Foucault comes dangerously close to this position. Forst can argue here for the universality of justice and propose that freedom from domination ought to be a justifiable universal demand, but his theory of justice will never allow for any determinate negation of injustice. Systems of justification are forever, systems of justification are forever in a process of rebuilding themselves, being open to rejustifications and relegitimations. So justification is thereby reified into a kind of a liberal democratic form of deliberation. And if colonial situations expose the inner decay of liberalism, they will, in a way, according to Forst's schema, regardless of the cost, eventually fold into the space of reasons of the colonizer. Okay, so I'm coming here to the end. So clearly there is more room for ethics than there is for politics today in the project of critique. The Foucauldianization of critical theory through the accommodation of genealogies and narratives is possible through the disavowal of Marx's account of capital as a structural totality, however we talk about the totality, whether it totalizes or not, and so on. Of course, we know that Foucault's relationship to Marx was more than strained, right? His theory of governmentality lends itself to describing what already exists in neoliberalism after the 70s, right? That's, society doesn't exist, but that is why it must be defended. Consequently, the sets of ethical practices that become kind of performatively generated and translated into affects and sentiments, these are what make up for the dissociated sociality. Okay, but is not dissociated sociality an effect of commodification? The blindness of contemporary critical theorists to how capital as a system of mediation co-opts subjectivity is baffling. There is a form determination at work in the money form, and in the money form and commodity form. And these are not simply instruments of domination or means of domination. They are also direct embodiments of sociality, whereby the social stands above and against individual human subjects. And what Foucault does is he replaces these form determinations with genealogies of knowledge, which I think is what Forst smuggles into his theory, that must be countered, right, by a remaking of history for Foucault, albeit through fictions, right? For Forst, they just have to be folded into the schema of justifications. And for Foucault, these genealogies are crucial to rationalization, and the counter genealogies to be constructed against them via a process of insubordination are also produced analogously, right? They're kind of the mirror, it's like a mirror image. The processes are happening kind of Janus face of the same thing. So in other words, the subject is formed by regimes of power knowledge, must seek to reform itself in relation to the very norms that constitute it. Again, this is a quote here, which is from Butler, who is a close reader of Foucault. The formation of the subject is the institution of the very reflexivity that indistinguishably assumes the burden of formation. The indistinguishability of this line is precisely the juncture where social norms intersect with ethical demands, and where both are produced in the context of a self-making which is never fully self-inaugurated. Okay, so what happens here in this kind of schema is that the subject becomes the object of self-reflection, only for it to emerge as an object, basically, a kind of a stylized object of insubordination. And the process that underlines the sphere of the normative here, whether it's rationalization or knowledge power, is copied mimetically onto the processes of self-care. There's no escape from power-knowledge nexus. In a way, Foucault smuggles back into post-foundationalism and post-structuralism the normative horizon of capitalism, which Habermas, as we all know, surrendered to long ago. All struggles against power are in turn only ultimately interested in power. We can just remember that statement that Foucault made in his debate with Chomsky, right? Where, he told Chomsky, I would reply to you and say the proletariat does not wage war against the ruling class because it considers such a war to be just. The proletariat makes war with the ruling class because for the first time in history, it wants power, right? This was Foucault's reading of social kind of revolution. So, I mean, Foucault, he renders critique, what it becomes is just a practice of epistemic humility, right? He supplements normativity with an openness to genealogy, a recognition of interdependency, mutual obligations, etc., etc. And these can only be adjudicated through kind of and in relationship to the restrictions of the juridico-legal category of individuality. Okay, so although Forst claims to develop a theory of power that is different from Foucault's, what he ultimately develops is fundamentally what he calls, and I quote from him, a discourse theoretical notion of non-domination that reduces justice to the ambivalence generated in the interaction between self-justifying individuals and the space of reasons. Because of this noumenal nature of power, because according to Forst, and he repeats statements like this a lot in his work, we cannot know what is in people's heads, end of quote, critical theory becomes the movement of, in a way, ambivalence between these two sides, right? And this is the quote number 2 down there. This is Forst, critique of relations of justifications aims at a survey of the various social and political positions. It's like a survey. Critique becomes a survey of generating and exercising discursive power in different social and political spheres, etc. So critique becomes the attempt to measure what is essentially out of measure, right? Noumenal. Rather than claim justice, which you would imagine any critical theory would want to do, to be the axiom, the very axiom of politics, right? One would imagine this. Forst turns justice into a question of power. Now, the danger of this move lies, and this is, I think, what I've been trying to kind of show, is that the danger of this move lies in evacuating critical theory from its most fundamental principle. It turns critique into an adjudication of the subjective nature of injustices. Right? So the sphere of deliberations and exchange of reasons cannot see the fundamental injustices in a way that are not immediately perceptible to subjects. So it becomes to share the kind of intersubjective blindness, right? It is ironic that Forst himself falls prey to this very question, where, the injustices suffered by Palestinians at the hand of a colonizing occupation is imperceptible in relation to the historical injustice committed against the Jews in Europe. Moreover, not only does Forst turn justice into a question of power, but he also vacates justice from any relation to truth. And the conclusion of deliberations about justice is, in the end, about the force of reasons and the reasons of force. Insofar as we can show how self-reflexive subjects would like to be represented and by what system of justification. So, in a way, kind of this parallax of justice becomes a liberal void of eternal regress into the discourse of individual rights, individuals who matter, and clearly those who do not. Thank you. That was the end of it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for this thorough engagement with this principles of solidarity, which I also gave quite some thought, but I didn't give it this much thought that I attempted to explain it as following from Forst's critical theory. So I think this is very useful work. Who would like to respond or ask a question to Nadia? Maybe you can raise your hand virtually or just in the video. Or I can begin by trying to articulate some response to what you just gave us.
I mean, maybe it was a bit dense, but yeah.
Yeah, it was very dense, but I think the density comes from your attempt to
Understand.
well, yeah, and also to relate these principles of solidarity by Forst and Habermas and the other two to Forst's entire critical theoretical project, which I think is very provocative and very useful. I was struck in that said, yeah, it's useful because there are also some responses that took the kind of progressive, except for Palestine stance, and saw this statement really as a betrayal of the fundamental principles of critical theory that these thinkers would otherwise hold so dear. So that, like in the book Progressive, except for Palestine, the solution to this irrational glitch would really be to hold these thinkers, yeah, or to point out the hypocrisy or to point out the contradiction. And I think what you're doing in this lecture is really to show how this statement follows, in fact, from the theory itself. Maybe I wanted to ask you something about some of the formulations in the statements, which, yeah, in German the word is Stellungnahme, right? So it's a position taking, and I was struck by the lack of even an attempt at rational argumentation in that statement. It's really a collage of some very bold, yeah, position takings that aren't necessarily even logically or grammatically connected to each other. Even the anti-Semitism paragraph leaves open how exactly that last paragraph relates to the previous one, even though it insinuates a lot. But perhaps a question here could be that yeah, one of the positions taken is that accusing Israel of genocide fundamentally, yeah, they don't say that accusing Israel of genocide does not meet the standards of judgment. But instead, they write that if you accuse Israel of genocide, then the standards of judgment slip completely. They verrutschen. So I was wondering if you can relate this to your reading of Forst. And to me, the statement seemed very Schmittian, a Schmittian sovereign intervention in the public sphere, comparable to the German parliament's yeah, Stellungnahmen about the BDS movement and its pronouncements about how it is anti-Semitic without feeling any obligation to even provide any support or evidence for those positions taken. Is that something you can
Yeah,
respond to?
no, thanks. That's actually really it's very interesting comment, and I see the point about thinking of this as a kind of a Schmittian kind of intervention, you know, in a way that this is kind of the exception is stated, right? This kind of the act of intervening is itself kind of a political act, right? And of course, you know, Schmidt's whole point was that the deficit in liberalism is the reason why we need this kind of political theological moment of like declaration, or right? And so, I mean, and I think it's really strange that and strange, but also not so strange in the sense that, you know, Habermas for a long time, and you know the whole school, you know, and its kind of second and third iterations. I mean, they've, as I think they've ultimately accepted that there's, you know, the liberal kind of the liberal democratic sphere of justification is the only kind of, you know, it's the horizon. It is the normative horizon. And any other, you know, it's just about kind of, how do you say, releasing its restrictions and constantly kind of surveying where it's kind of, you know, placing limits on you know, the ability to kind of reason and justify, right? But then you see what happens with kind of a Forst theory of justification. It becomes a theory about power. And I think ultimately what happens is that this theory of, you know, this kind of theory of kind of reducing justification almost to kind of this kind of obverse side of power, right? There's kind of, it's just either we have that or we have this kind of unleashed power that has no that has nothing to hold it back, right? Makes way, or in a way has to be linked. I mean, I don't know if one could say it's theoretically consistent in the sense that, you know, it does open way, because I mean the stuff on narratives becomes a central component in the way that he starts to think about justification, right? And you think, where does that come from, right? Clearly it's not something like oral histories or like you know, narratives that people who have no official histories seek to put together in all kinds of ways, right? So, I mean, what is narrative if it's not kind of, in a way, also kind of a formal, kind of a kind of a kind of a historicization? Like, so what would it be, right? And what narratives would be measured? Why would certain narratives be more justify, you know, have more justification, whatever, to them than others, right? Because that's precisely what happens. And I think ultimately it's the, you know, because I mean, how can these kind of German critical theorists go against Germany? I mean, how can they be non-German? I mean, and this is kind of it places, I mean, the irony of this is that, you know, at the moment Frankfurt School is turning towards post-colonial studies, one can say, you know, okay, I know post-colonial studies is a train that's already crashed many times, but it's a bit of a late arrival of them to the station. But then, you know, it's a post-colonial studies that is also fashioned, the ones that they're interested in is one that's fashioned according to this kind of the debates about normativity and, you know, opening it up and how to do so and so on and so forth. It's not, they're not interested in post-colonial theories that have other theoretical commitments, right? That want to come in and maintain commitments to, let's say, Marx or whatever, psychoanalysis, which are these are the foundations of critical theory, technically, you know,
Anti-colonialism.
and anti-colonialism, which these become fundamental tools, right? For, I mean, these kind of so it's a very perplexing moment we are in, and you know, I did have this debate with Forst, and he and the time when we, I mean, he's heard this paper, and you know, he just kept categorically refusing everything I said with no real, you know, there was no real whatever. Substantive engagement. So, but then the count of deaths I think we were at 7,600, and he wouldn't even then, you know, say, even grant me the use of the word genocidal intent. He wouldn't even grant me that. Okay. And that was a, you know, and I mean, and I, you know, it was, so this places people who want to do, people who really are committed to universality, critical theorists who are working in the tradition of critical theory and expanding it in other ways outside Europe. It places them in a very bad position, right? Because how does when the universality of critical theory itself falters in this way, when it becomes German again, right? How does this what kind of critical theory is there to come anyway, So this is a I do think the stakes of what's happening today are very high, and I do think, the links have to be made in ways that have to do with also the directions that this field of theory has gone through. And I do think, the Amy Allen work on decolonizing. So decolonizing critical theory becomes about decolonizing it from the narrative of progress by Foucauldianizing it. Okay, that's ultimately kind of the claim, right? I'm suggesting that no, I think the real way forward is a proper decolonizing of critical theory means to really kind of dismantle this kind of Foucault Habermas, um, I think it's it is the kind of the dominant ideology in the field in different ways. I mean, there are other ways to kind of also approach this question, right? From other debates or other discussions that I didn't include here, but yeah, yeah.
Thanks, Antonio, and then Daniel.
Yes, thank you, Nadia, for the talk. It was really nice to have a chance to listen to it again. And I think just for a little bit of context about the seminar, also the idea to invite you was also born, or it started taking shape as part of a reading group that we have here at Tilburg University as a global Palestine reading group with mostly undergraduate students that come together and try to read some different things to make sense of the situation that we're in, of this emergency situation, and especially to try to make sense, or at least for me it has been like that, of the position of, for example, universities in Europe with regards to the genocide. So there have been calls to suspend collaborations with Israeli universities to take responsibility. And so that has made me think a lot about sort of the locus, the place of critical theory, and how, for example, in these discussions or about, or when it comes to claiming justice, for example, as an axiom of politics, the universities, at least sort of discursively, claim this, but then it has been the students and the mobilization that has actually sort of performed and acted based on these axiomatic commitments. So, I mean, I'm not sure I have a I have a question, but I just wanted sort of to point out that precisely, like, it was a very practical matter also that made us think of your work. And that made us think of your discussions, because I think the things that you're saying about Forst and about the liberal sphere of justification as sort of the normative horizon also helps us make sense a lot of the way in which universities or other institutions in Europe, at least, are dealing with the genocide and with the kind of response or lack of response that they have had. So yeah, I think it's just it was enough. There's maybe no question, but just I didn't want to leave out the chance to say that, and how this, let's say, how these concerns appeared for us here. Yeah, over here in Tilburg.
No, that's great. I mean, I was pleasantly surprised by the invitation, because obviously, yeah, I mean, there's huge censorship everywhere on the question of Palestine. But I do think, that there is, this is kind of, the old Althusserian trope, but there is a class struggle in theory, and I do think that. That there has to be a kind of things have to be named and placed in their, in a way that, there will be different kind of, I hope there will be a different kind of remembering later. That's not just again about rememorialization and the politics of memory and the way that they've played out, because in many ways, as I was suggesting at the end of the papers, that, and I think that was what was so interesting about Gillian Rose's critique, is that she saw already, right? This is in the late 80s. she saw already that what the politics of memory can do in relationship to the trajectory of the development of the liberal state, and precisely the sense for her of the question of what she calls the re-theologization of the Holocaust, right? I mean, and I think this idea of it's not, we have to think in ways that are not simply about this this binary, let's put it this way, of kind of representations of fascism, i.e. its memorialization, whatever, what one could call in terms of like when you watch wars and genocides and this kind of like it's like I don't know, like this kind of pornographication of horror, seeing all these images and but without falling into that and kind of and on the other hand, being committed to a fascism of representation, right? To like kind of identities, libertarianism, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, so this is the binary. I think that binary is at work. And there has to be a way to think about what's happening in the present moment to the Palestinian people that also speaks to, that they're not separate things. That speaks to theorists and people thinking, at the center of this binary and who see it, we're seeing it develop in ways, authoritarianism and whatever, fascism, call it what you may, as it is developing everywhere around us, and how to insist or persist or respond to that, right? And that does require, I think, a lot of work, theoretical work. It's not just about kind of saying, platitudes. Of course, solidarity is important, but that means that entails a lot of things, right? That entails an attempt to really think through the time we are in, and so, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Statement by Forst and Habermas is also called Principles of Solidarity, right? So,
yeah, yeah, yeah. But yeah.
Daniel?
Yeah, thanks so much. My question is really asking you to help me a bit more thinking with you through your argument. And I thought maybe a good way to do so would be the following. So your critique of the statement of principles links it to a critique of certain accounts of the Frankfurt School, Forst in particular. I guess a different way to critique the statement of principles would be to say that these authors betray their own theoretical commitments with that statement. And I'm not suggesting you should do this, but I was hoping that when you respond why you don't, I get a better grasp of the argument you presented in this presentation. Because for me, it was the first encounter. I understand other people have read the paper before or discussed it. Thank you.
Thank you for that. But I mean, how does one put it? So the betrayal of their theoretical commitments. I guess in a way, you could see that I was throughout the paper, I was trying to give more, how do you say, benefit of the doubt, right? I mean, how could it, if you do this and do this and do this and do that, how could it you maintain this position, right? Of course, my conclusion had to do with the place on the question of narrative, how much it's central, or kind of the way he expands it, accounts of justification to include narratives, because in a way that might explain, right? That because as you're as Mikhail just said, I mean there's a this kind of it's a real intervention in a particular public sphere in a particular manner, right? That statement. So I don't, I mean, not that I had sympathy, I didn't have like sympathies for Habermas's political project before this statement. Let me be clear about that. I mean, nor with the kind of the way that the Frankfurt School after Habermas and the directions it has gone, although it's it is obviously, there's many things to be said about it, right? I mean, from all the different, the kind of the focus on questions of recognition and, expanding, the normative. I mean, there's all kinds of, the directions it has taken, which I feel in many ways, I've always kind of felt that there was already a betrayal to the original project of critical theory. and even the ways they're heading today in terms of employing kind of sociology of knowledge. I mean, I think, and again here I feel like compelled to bring back in Rose. I mean, I was always, interested in the critique she made, and that, I think a great book called Hegel Contra Sociology, where she kind of developed this whole account of how, certain critical theoretical strains through a kind of certain neo-Kantianism become obsessed with the question of culture and values and validities and norms, and how that always ends up reproducing this kind of problem, this kind of Kantian doublet, right, between the empirical and so I mean, this is these are not kind of commitments I think that critical theory should be invested in from the start, right? And perhaps in a way for me it was like, it's not a eureka moment to see that they would end up signing this kind of statement. It was almost expected, right? But however, yes, I mean, the work of kind of reading, I would have never read Forst of my own accord. It's not really the stuff I'm working on or interested in. So I was really directly interpellated, and I spent quite some time going through this material just to kind of understand the project, like how could this be, right? But I guess my answer to the question would be, I think the betrayal has preceded the position. I mean, obviously, the position today, I mean, the betrayal of the theoretical commitments of critical theory, as I understand it, right, has already happened. And I think ensuant from that original sin, right, the betrayal of Marx and kind of the Marxian tradition of critical theory, we will see, or we see the developments in this direction. That would be kind of the way I would think about it, right? But I mean, perhaps you might not agree, but I have certain commitments in critical theory, and I do think that, Marx and psychoanalysis ought to and remain to be the fundamental driving, in a way, the motor of this entire field. And since the move away from that in directions towards kind of accepting kind of the horizon of liberal normativity, or kind of trying to just expand that, was already a mistake from the start. In a way, it was already a betrayal. Yeah.
Dies, and then Alenka.
Yes, so thank you, Nadia. Alenka, did you have a follow-up? Because mine is on a different topic. I was just wondering.
Yeah, perhaps, I mean, it is related. It was related a little bit to what Nadia just said about this
Oh, yeah,
kind
maybe that's good. Then I do mine
okay.
after, because it's a different topic.
Yeah, no, so thank you very much, Nadia. I really appreciate this talk. I had myself some experience with Frost, but in any way, I mean, as a general remark, I would say that I mean, Frankfurt School is long gone from Frankfurt. I mean, this is quite obvious. And from what I hear, even anecdotically, from new people they are hiring there, on what kind of grounds and justification of these grounds, it even seems that their main aim now is, when they travel abroad, to undo the damage done by the first Frankfurt School. I mean, this is what I heard. That it was even this kind of this is bad reputation. I mean, Frankfurt University no longer wants to have anything to do, or mean apart from some small lip service. But I really think that yeah, things have gone south or whatever, north or whatever, some time ago. And I think that what you said, because you nicely pointed out, I think precisely this paradox, okay, they have this double blind spot, like a theoretical one, they cannot really justify their justification. I mean, their act of, because it's clearly a decision, you say, okay, we support unconditionally. I mean, this is nothing to do with justification. We unconditionally support Israel because of them. Yeah, no words allowed for another argument. So there is this blind spot, but I think in a way, and it came across, at least for me in what you were saying, that it looks like this blind point is already at the outset of this theory, of this theoretical endeavor, attempt, elaborations, very sophisticated for a while, at points. So the theory is there precisely in order to justify this blind spot, or to make it kind of, so there is a certain circularity, and I could not agree more with this assessment of this move that I also think was quite catastrophic in terms of concept, this huge conceptual move that happened quite some time ago, from the term politics to the word power. All of a sudden, everything just became about power, and there is no escape for power. And I mean, this is just something that I think it's really, and for this to take place in critical theory, I really think there is a problem there. And this kind of double level, exception, exteriority, interiority, extremism, whatever is the fundamental for any kind of critical stance. And this kind of acrobatic of justification is really something that belongs to a very different tradition. But okay, I will stop here so that other people.
No, thank you. I mean, obviously, I mean, I'm very happy you're here, and thank you for the comment. And yeah, and it's fortuitous. I mean, you know very well about disavow. I mean, this is like, you know, this is. I mean, you say that there's
disavowal, precisely.
lots of,
the whole
yeah,
edifice,
I mean,
rational edifice is there. We know very well, yeah, there are these problems, but the whole edifice is there to kind of mask precisely the real that this knowledge should be about, and it is not. So.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you think, I mean, I don't even need to, I mean, one can take, I mean, okay, someone like Marcuse, as much as one might have differences and issues with certain analyses and so on, but, you know, at least when it came to an attempt to analyze authority, you know, he insisted on a number of things that you can, you know, that there's a reification of authority, that there is this and that there's domination and exploitation, and they do this and that. And he talks about the rise of the managerial. There's an analysis of power that is grounded and rooted in, you know, in really existing conditions, and that also involve the psychical mechanisms of power. And so, I mean, for me, that remains to be, I mean, so why do we need to discard something like that, okay, to replace it with this? I mean, you know, it's very perplexing. And I think obviously there are fundamentally political and historical reasons for the reason we are in this mess.
Yeah. No, but
yeah.
I also agree. Perhaps I will just add a point, although perhaps here we disagree a little bit. But when I was actually, this was the book before, but thinking about Antigone, I think that there is a way in which you could read Creon precisely as this figure of a contemporary state power. I mean, state violence, not simply state violence, because it is the violence that it's not exactly systemic, it's not exactly subjective in the sense of resistance, but it is a kind of real subjective state violence. And I think this is exactly also what we are seeing now in Israel, other places. But anyway, this is just another, I think there is something about this and the gesture to just say, really no to this kind of state violence, that this is why for me there is still something about this Antigone figure that resonates in this kind of political way, not simply ethical. But this is a different kind of discussion, so I will really now.
That's very interesting, though. So to kind of to read this kind of violence in terms of a kind of subjective explosion of violence.
Yeah, I think, I mean, for Creon, he is the head of the state, but it's actually a subjective violence that he can deploy through this. I mean, it's not so, but okay, this perhaps
okay,
it would need to be developed a little bit more in extenso. But yeah, there is something here which even doesn't simply fit the difference between subjective and objective violence, but becomes a kind of a perverse figure that precisely because it combines both seems to be inassailable. You know, how will you tackle this? But anyway.
No, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that also reminds me of the notorious word gruesome, the fixed adjective that has to be included in every mentioning of the violence of Hamas. Thies.
Yes. Yeah, so thank you, Nadia, for this. So I took one of your objections to Forst to be that Marx's critique of capitalism is an ontological one and not simply a moral one. Correct me if I didn't get that right. And in reply, you affirmed the theft of time as decisive for understanding Marx's project. So I'm wondering about the ontology of time here. So I just want to invite you to say something more about that. Shouldn't surprise you that this is coming from me. And
No,
so
it's not
I,
surprising. Yeah. Mhm.
I assume it's not Benjamin's homogeneous empty time, but at the same time, there does need to be some commensurability, right? Because as you put it, for Marx, it is of the essence of human life. And I also ask this question because I wonder about the relation between history and time in your exposition. So I hope this is clear what I'm getting at.
Thanks, Deej, for the big question, as per usual. No, I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess, I mean, at this point, yeah, Benjamin is in the background here, but not only, I would imagine, because the whole thing about abstract time, right? So the whole thing about the abstraction and kind of okay, the time, that there's an abstraction socially necessary. Labor time and kind of Marxist critique is already kind of an abstraction of time, right? So that abstraction is what is at work in whatever all T1, T2, T3 times that through which surplus is being the repetition compulsion of valorization, right? So in that sense, yes, I mean, in that sense, there is a theft of time, right? That is a time in the sense that that theft is also the theft that renders the kind of the actualization of free human activity to be possible, right? So I mean, or kind of that whatever. Rather, it's kind of it's whatever. It's being deactualized all the time. So I guess I meant it in this sense. I don't. I mean, this is, I don't. there's a lot to be said about this stuff, right? I mean, in terms of what are the Marxian kinds of analyses that emerge from, the focus on time. I don't think you can take any one versus the other. You have to be able to draw out the kind of the totality and from different places. But so when you say, I mean, the question of history and time, and I think that's a very important question. I mean, I think especially with the point I was trying to get at, I mean, I don't think this is what you were asking, but I'm just going to say what I have about this now, but we can talk about it more later, is that the point about when I said that, that there is a colonial context, whether there is an occupation, there is it's only, in the colonial context, really, I mean, you think of Fanon or you think about Fanon's argument that that this kind of a doubled alienation of the colonized, right? That their history is lost. They can never recuperate it. So that loss has happened, and all that they get is an image of their history that is whatever from the colonizer. You are a population, okay? You are a Palestinian population or something. Let's put it in this kind, right? And then even there's no way to recuperate that. So they have all these myriad images of self-representation that become whatever exaggerations of the attempt to make up for this loss. Call them what you want, all forms of these religious politics, theological, political, whatever, okay? And then there's also kind of there's that kind of phenomenological kind of theft, and then there's the theft on the level of the bodies, the labor. What are they doing? What are they extra? What kind of and it becomes very complex, right? I mean, so you do need. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say, I think your question is really very fundamental and very important. You need a kind of you have to have an account of history or the kind of the specific kind of tempo or temporality of this kind of theft that happens precisely in this site that exposes I think contradictions that maybe are less, I don't know what to say, kind of palpable or experienced in the center of empire or whatever, at the center of kind of Western societies or but that's, obviously so many things can come out of this. I don't mean this, the result of it's to be this kind of an Agambenian, whatever kind of bare lives, or I don't mean it. And I obviously don't mean it in terms of, in the Foucauldian sense or, I do think there's a hugely complex answer that can come from psychoanalysis, but I'm not sure that that's kind of what I would want to do right now. But thanks though for the comment.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there anyone else who would like to say something or ask something?
No, thank you for your lecture. My background is not in philosophy, but in sociology, and I interpreted your talk as a plea to get the sociology back in back in here. So not to abstract power and taking with that sort of the hegemony of a liberal discourse, but really look at what is going on and look at power relations and the narratives that come with certain positions. So yeah, that was very helpful in trying to understand this. Yeah, for me, the surprising route that Habermas took here, but that clarified it a lot. So thank you for that. I also have to go, so. So I say goodbye and hope I'll
Right.
hear
Thank
you
you.
later. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Nadia, do you want to say something in closing or?
No, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for attending.
Yeah, thanks so much for accepting our invitation, Antonio's invitation. I'm also very happy that this came together. The people
Thank you.
from Tilburg who are here are coming from different faculties, and most of us have met through Palestine solidarity activism and through the reading group that Antonio
Wonderful.
mentioned
Yeah.
earlier. And yeah, you mentioned Sami Khatib earlier. I'm also reminded of the Benjamin conference in Ramallah that we had over a decade ago.
Wonderful. Yeah. Yeah.
The chore that you performed for us to really go into Forst's work, which I also had no interest in, but I recognize the importance of it precisely because these ideas really are quite important in European academia. But insisting on the term critical theory and recuperating what
Trying to.
yeah.
I would just mention that.
Yeah.
Thank you. I would just mention, actually, I think I didn't know that it was already published. I don't know if it was published today or a day ago on this talk on the historical materialism blog. So if people found this, I don't know. I just yeah, you can actually read the whole paper online now. It was published I think yesterday or today. I'm not sure. I just saw it today. But yeah, thanks again for having me, and I hope the collective thing coming around this question develops in all kinds of ways that are sustainable without sustainability. But yeah, okay.
Thanks so much. Thanks everybody for being here.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. See you, Lenka. Bye. Thanks.
Nadia,
Thanks,
take
everyone.
care.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you, Michiel, for moderating.
Yeah, thank you, Antonio. You could have moderated